Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
First of all, we have someone who's been around now for the past few days, Professor Jeff Schloss, who's Distinguished Professor of Biology in the Westmont College. He's also directs there the Center for Faith, Ethics and the Life Sciences. And Jeff was actually on sabbatical with our other speaker last year in Oxford, and they worked together a lot as a team in developing various ideas associated also with evolutionary biology. So our second speaker, Jeff is going to come and speak first, and then I'll introduce now also our second speaker at the same time, who's Professor Michael Murray. He is Professor in the Humanities and Philosophy at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It's a liberal arts college there. And he's written widely actually over the past few years, had a number of very fine books in the whole area that we're going to be tackling today, of theodicy, nature read in tooth and claw, theism and the problem of animal suffering and so forth. So some of those books you'll find, as well as Jeff's books, you'll find on the bookstore. And the topic we're going to tackle today is a really big one, evolutionary evil and a good creative question mark. So it's the whole question of theodicy and so forth. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Jeff then to take us through the first part of the session. Thank you, Jeff.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you. I've greatly enjoyed and benefited from the last few days of exchange with a number of you, both on the intellectual and personal level. It's a little challenging. Here on the last day of the conference, oftentimes a conference organizer would save the best for last. In this case, they saved the worst for last. And quite literally the worst. They've saved evil for the last. But we want to take a look at this. I'm a biologist, Michael's a philosopher. This question of the problem of natural evil in evolutionary theory. You know, a widely circulated quote from Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess in 1615 is, "The Bible tells us how to go to heaven. Science tells us how the heavens go." And if the relationship between science and faith were that simple, we actually wouldn't be here. The fact of the matter is, to continue the play on words, in the Abrahamic faiths, and in fact in most theistic traditions altogether, the faith or the tradition also suggests how heaven came to us. That is to say, how the natural world reflects divine activity and divine purposes, either in the outworking of history or at least in the initial structure of the cosmos itself. And I should say, so it's not this simple, and in fact, Galileo didn't think it was that simple either. Although this quote is floating around widely, this is not what he actually said in the letter to the Grand Duchess. What he actually said was much more nuanced, and this little sentence, in fact, isn't even from him. He attributes it to somebody else. In any case, for any tradition, any religious tradition, or for that matter, any non-religious moral tradition that views the cosmos as morally structured, the existence of natural evil constitutes a problem. Now, I need to distinguish between moral evil and natural evil. I mean, after these talks, a lot of people frequently come up and say, well, a lion eating a gazelle is not evil. And in fact, moral evil would involve a moral agent doing or choosing to do wrong and inflict harm on another. Philosophers like to use counterfactual. So let me give you a counterfactual. Imagine a world where there was a philosopher, say from Indiana, who came to Cambridge and actually stood in front of a group, something like this, and blamed others for dragging him off to the bar at night. Now that would be a moral evil if in fact the individual were known to be a party monger himself. This is being recorded. This might not make sense to viewers, but we've had a good time this week. Now, in any given moral system, there are always some individuals that are given a pass on moral claims. Perhaps deities don't need to live up to the same moral rules as everybody else. In our society, rock stars oftentimes aren't expected to live up to the same moral standards. We call this rock star evil. Here's a picture of a rock star actually out partying one night, and here's a picture of him the next day. So natural evil, on the other hand, is evil suffering not perpetrated by moral agents. And maybe one of the first people to articulate this problem is it's often ascribed to Epicurus. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Now, at prima facie, this argument looks pretty compelling, and in fact, it's often taken to settle the matter. Here's something I found on a recent website articulating the same argument: atheists winning since 33 AD. But actually, the argument isn't that slam dunk. It can be rephrased as a modus tollens, or a denying the consequence argument, like this: if an all-wise, all-powerful, all-good God exists, then evil would not exist. Evil does exist, therefore God does not exist, or he's not perfect in wisdom, potency, or goodness. Now, actually, the logic of this argument is sound. But what isn't sound is the premise. It turns out, actually, there's no good warrant to believe that if there were an all-wise, all-powerful, all-good being, that no evil would exist. There can be all sorts of reasons that some evil might exist, for the very same reason that parents allow their children to suffer. It helps them. But this can be solved, and here's where evolutionary biology comes in, actually, by just modifying the first premise. An all-wise, all-powerful, all-good God would prevent gratuitous evil. That is to say, evil, the magnitude of which is not accompanied by compensatory goods, and evil, the existence of which is unnecessary for the attainment of these goods. And if that's the case, well, there appears to be gratuitous evil, and therefore God seems to be implausible. Now, any theodicy that attempts to exonerate God from this problem has the two tasks of demonstrating that, or at least suggesting a plausible scenario in which the magnitude of evil is accompanied by compensatory goods, and these goods could not have been attained without this evil. And Michael's going to take that on at about the halfway mark. But what I want to explore with you as a biologist is the other side of this. Any criticism, any argument from evil needs to suggest why the magnitude of evil is not accompanied by compensatory goods and why its existence is not necessary. And in fact, over the last 150 years or so, there's been a giant sea change, largely in response to discoveries of the natural sciences, which argue the magnitude is exorbitant, and it's not clear why such evils are necessary. Now, this sea change was signaled, and Ted Peters actually quoted a line from this the other day, by Alfred Lord Tennyson's famous poem, In Memoriam. And man who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature, red in tooth and claw with ravage, shrieked against this creed. This round of green, this orb of flame, the earth, the sun, fantastic beauty such as lurks in some wild poet when he works without a conscience or an aim. So the claim here is not that the cosmos isn't beautiful, but it gives no indication of going anywhere and having been structured by a designer with a moral aim. Now, of course, this is picked up by many modern exegetes of nature. Maybe the most famous contemporary quote is Richard Dawkins' quote from Rivers of Eden, re-quoted in Science, actually. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there's at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, why are people arguing this? And what I want to look at with you in evolutionary theory is three claims. First of all, the extensiveness of natural evil, the magnitude of which simply seems to be uncompensated for by attending goods. Secondly, the role or centrality of evil. It's not just a post hoc add-on to creation, but it's actually part of the engines of what makes creation work. And lastly, the dearth or absence of natural beneficence. And again, I'm not talking about moral goodness. I'm just talking about the analog of natural evil, which we might consider non-moral beneficence or natural beneficence. These are all attributed widely to Darwin, or the implications of Darwinism. So here we go. the extensiveness of evil. And there are a number of findings in the 19th century that launched this enterprise. First of all, the discovery of parasitoid natural history. So parasitoids are a type of parasite that invariably results in the death of the host. The iconic example of this is the ichneumon wasp, which lays eggs in its host, the caterpillar in this case. Then the eggs become larvae. They feed on the flesh of the living caterpillar and then eat their way out. This was discovered around the time of Darwin, and it really shook up the romantic sentiments, the romantic idealization of nature at the time. And Darwin himself, in a letter to Hooker, the year after The Origin was published, says, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars." Secondly, just the discovery, at least by Europeans at that time, of the tropics, and the remarkable natural history of tropical organisms and tropical armaments. So it would be fun to tell you stories with each of these creatures, but just in my experience in the tropics with students, I have experienced this little fellow called a bullet ant. Some people call them 24-hour ants because you wish you were dead for 24 hours. Regarded to be the most painful, not lethal, but the most painful insect sting in the world. It's gnarly. Portuguese man of wars. Here's one, the botfly, which is another parasite that actually is really interesting. It has a little cement, and it lays eggs on the abdomen of a mosquito. And then when the mosquito bites you, the heat from your skin melts this cement, and the egg enters your body. The egg hatches, and then the larvae just feeds on your flesh. And the incubation time is about 8 weeks. When I had several of these, I brought them home. I didn't know what to declare on my customs form, if I'm bringing in any living materials or not. And I really wanted, as a male, I never had the opportunity to give birth, so I thought I would let it incubate until the end. But about 6 weeks in, the pain is so excruciating, I had to go to the doctor and have it cut out. Of course, there are many more orifices that these can colonize, maybe most famous of which are poison arrow frogs, some of the most potent toxin on Earth, actually. I'm just having fun with you here, but but I do have to say again personally, when I take students into the field in North America, I often find myself spontaneously singing a particular hymn. This is my Father's home. This is my Father's world. And when I go to the tropics, I often find myself singing another hymn. This world is not my home. And there is this tension in creation, this ambiguity in creation, which was the recognition of which was very much, and there's some interesting papers recently in the history of biology. This recognition was very much fueled by exploration of the tropics. Reflecting on this lavish evil, Richard Dawkins says the total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear, others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites, thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. Now, in addition to just the extravagance of the evil we see, we also discovered evil that we hadn't seen, or apparent evil, in the fossil record. So just the sheer amount and scale of destruction in the fossil record is overwhelming, actually. A few days ago, somebody mentioned that when the fossil record was first discovered, people attributed it to the flood. That's actually not quite true. When it was first discovered, Christians wrestled with this deeply and were reticent to believe that the fossil record represented organisms that ever existed. The record of destruction just seemed so massive. So there was actually a theory that fossils were not bones of previously living organisms, but they were derived from natural processes of mineralization out of which certain structures could form, something akin to the formation of a diamond from coal, for example, or the formation of crystals. And it turns out that this theory was rejected, but that was the first impulse upon discovery of the fossil record. And then secondly, the primordial place of death. So it looks like death existed hundreds of millions of years, billions of years actually, before humans ever existed. Now I want to call up Tennessee again. So he wrestles with this, and he says, "Are God and nature then at strife, that nature lends such evil dreams? So careful of the type she seems, so careless of the single life." So first of all, he's thinking that nature is wanton with respect to the survival of any individual organism, but at least the types get preserved. And then he concludes, so careful of the type? But no. From scarped cliff and quarried stone, she cries, 1,000 types are gone. I care for nothing. All shall go. More recently, David Hull, this is an amazing statement to be published in a leading journal of science, by the way, Nature. The evolutionary process is rife with happenstance, contingency, incredible waste, death, pain, and horror. Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the date of natural history may be like, he is not a loving God who cares about his productions. Careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom anybody would be inclined to pray. So those are the observations and the inferences on the extensiveness of evil. Let me just make a few comments. I mean, the first one is, actually, I don't want to diminish the reality of these observations, but none of them are strict entailments of evolution. These features are just there in the natural world, and by the way, they would be there if all the organisms that ever lived were specially created by God, supernaturally. So these are not strict entailments of evolution. In fact, I've just been reading Tennyson to you, but that whole magisterial poem was written 10 years before Darwin wrote The Origin. So this was in the air in the transition from Romanticism to Victorianism before Darwin ever proposed this theory. Secondly, there are mitigating observations. And the question is, how are we going to exegete nature? What's the message that nature's trying to give? And it's actually not univocal. So yes, we discovered parasitoidism, but there's also the natural history of mutualism. This is really interesting. We made observations of parasitoidism and mutualism at about the same time, but it took us a century longer to accept mutualism. One of the organisms that I've worked on is lichens. And lichens are a symbiosis between a fungus and an algae. And the person who first argued that this was a symbiotic or mutualistic relationship, it took almost a century to believe that nature could contain interactions like this. So mutualism, of course, is an interaction where both species benefit. Here's one of my favorite, the Nile crocodile and the Egyptian plover. And the plover basically functions as a dental hygienist for the Nile crocodile. Well, 5 root canals, 3 cavities, and 1 fractured crown. Daisy, cancel all my other appointments for the day. So nature is not only red in tooth and claw, but it's not that simple even. The line between mutualism and parasitism is a hazy one. And mutualistic relationships can shift into parasitic relationships. We ought be that confident of the goodness of nature. Philosophers who actually think more theoretically and less empirically could get into trouble if they... I was trying to think of a joke to bring Tim O'Connor in again. Secondly, just very quickly, you might ask which tropics. It so happened that we encountered the neotropics in Central and South America. Had we discovered first the South Pacific tropics, one of my favorite places on Earth? There actually are no lethally venomous organisms there. And there are no macro predators there. It's really close to a paradise. So that's ecologically possible. But human beings could not have evolved in such an environment. In fact, there's no macrofauna at all there, except originally, except for humans who got there in boats. And lastly, how about the fossil record? Well, a couple of quick comments here. David Hull's comment, and this is a comment that's repeated frequently, about the massive waste over evolutionary history. That's really a strange comment when you think about it. Waste is a teleological conception. It says that it entails inefficient movement toward a particular goal given a base of resources. And so call something wasteful, you have to know what the goal is and you have to know what the relevant resources are. Strictly biologically, nature doesn't seem very wasteful at all. There's not a single organism who dies scarcely, whose biomass is not well utilized. What would it mean to be wasteful? Well, ultimately, well, I guess if you're losing species, you'd be wasteful if the species were not being used for what they were intended to be used for. If you're a naturalist, I'm not sure how you could be wasteful. If you're a theist, then you'd have to know what God's purposes were for these species. So this is a theological statement without a theological rationale. Still, you might say, yes, but this massive extinction. Now, I actually don't want to be hard-hearted here, but in terms of death and suffering, extinction doesn't add to the problem. The sum total of deaths in the history of Earth is just about exactly one per organism, whether or not there's extinction. So there may be an aesthetic issue here, but it doesn't seem to be a natural evil issue, one of death and suffering here. And lastly, I don't know what to do with this one because I'm not a theologian, but there is the issue of what I would call a diluvian deity. Whether or not the fossil record was created over hundreds of millions of years, or whether or not it was created in 1 year by a massive deluge, as creationists claim, and for which, by the way, I think there is no scientific evidence. But nevertheless, that account is found in the traditions of the Abrahamic faith. And by the way, even if you don't read those first 11 chapters of Genesis literally or historically, and I myself do not, nevertheless, if it's a metaphor of something. And the picture of God in those first 11 chapters bestows to him the rights to devastate creation. That's a theological problem that's raised by the Abrahamic scriptures themselves. Many of our depictions of the Noahic flood are childlike depictions of a kind of a happy event. But if we take a 19th century depiction, this is Gustave Doré's Bible illustrations from just 6 years after Darwin published The Origin. That's an event accompanied by massive suffering. And that's massive suffering that comes from the accounts of the scriptures, not just natural history. Lastly, I would want to make a difference between scientific exegesis, that is to say, decoding the world according to the discoveries of science, and using science for apologetics, either anti-religious or religious apologetics. I'll give you an example again from Richard Dawkins' same book, River Out of Eden. If nature were kind, she would at least make the minor concession of anesthetizing caterpillars before they are eaten alive from within. It's easy to imagine a gene that, say, tranquilizes gazelles when they are about to suffer a killing bite. Now, it's hard to see why this should be so, and we may therefore guess that gazelles suffer horrible pain and fear when they are pursued to the death, as most of them eventually are. I actually agree that it is hard to imagine why natural selection would favor such a trait. Although science is not just involved in the process of guessing, it's involved in the process of observing. And it turns out Dawkins is just wrong on this. And he would have known he was wrong had he checked the literature. He could have gone back 100 years, actually, to David Livingstone's account of being attacked by a lion. I saw the lion in the act of springing upon me. He caught my shoulder as he sprang, and we both came to the ground together, growling horribly close to my ear. He shook me as a terrier dog does a rat. The shock produced a stupor. It caused a sort of dreaminess in which there was no sense of pain or feeling of terror, and this particular state probably produces in all animals killed by the carnivora. If so, is a merciful provision by our benevolent creator for lessening the pain of death. Now, I mean, Livingstone is doing just as much theology here as Dawkins is doing atheology, but the empirical question is, was this just a weird experience, or is this actually a feature of how pain works? And we actually know now that it is a natural, and we know that it's the mid-60s. The gate theory of pain actually gives us an account of why under extreme pain, the sense of pain is attenuated. So this suggests to me that in addition to just strictly scientific issues and the philosophical issues that Michael will talk about soon, there are also existential issues. There are issues of personal perspective that people bring to making these judgments. What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horribly cruel works of nature, Darwin writes in a letter to Hooker. The animal world is on about the same level as a gladiator show. The Hobbesian war of each against all is the normal state of existence, Huxley writes in a famous essay called The Struggle for Existence. And in a letter a year earlier, he writes, you see a meadow rich in flower and foliage, and your memory rests upon it as an image of peaceful beauty. It's a delusion. Not a bird twitters, but is either slayer or slain. Not a moment passes in that a holocaust in every hedge and every copse, battle, murder, and sudden death are the order of the day. These are grand exegetical claims about the kind of core truth of nature, and in each of these cases, in Darwin's case, in Huxley's case, actually in Tennyson's case, they were written shortly after the loss of a loved one. In Darwin's case, it was his daughter, Annie. In Tennyson's case, it was his best friend in college. And in Huxley's case, it was his sister who died an early and untimely death. I'm not doing psychological deconstruction here, and by the way, there's a big and fascinating debate right now about the role of the loss of Darwin's daughter and his loss of faith. So, but nevertheless, only to say that these people suffered tremendous personal losses prior to making these claims about the natural world. Okay, how about the centrality of evil? Now this seems to be a more evolutionary claim, and the scientific proposition, if I were going to kind of state it in popular terms, is competition, or the struggle for existence, is the engine of evolutionary change, and death is the requisite fuel for the fire. Oops. How about a scientific response to these claims? I mean, the claim here is that that evolution, it's not just the existence of animal suffering, but it's the existence of the very mechanism by which animals come about that's the problem. The primordial nature of death and struggle are unarguable. So Michael's going to deal a little bit with the implications of that for traditional theodicies. However, it turns out that natural selection is actually not equal to, and although Darwin was very influenced by Malthus and the idea of competitive struggle, it turns out that it doesn't even require competition. Competition, strictly defined as the presence of one organism, two organisms decreasing one another's fitness. And the definition of natural selection is differential reproduction of genotypes. So that's what natural selection is. You could have natural selection, and in fact you do have natural selection where there's no competition, where there are endless resources, and some organisms just lead more offspring than others. That's natural selection. And we know that in the course of evolutionary history, this very often happens with the development of new niches, or with the development of cooperative synergy. And both these cases involve significant natural selection without competition. Now, I'm not saying natural selection can't involve competition, and in fact, in many situations, competition increases the efficacy of selection. But actually, that's a fascinating debate in evolutionary biology, too. Secondly, natural selection does not require or necessarily entail death, even. Differential mortality may play a role in natural selection. By the way, this is a fascinating topic in the biosciences right now. Debates between evolutionary accounts of death. In this case, natural selection wouldn't require death, but natural selection would generate death by a variety of mechanisms. Versus death being due to altogether different factors, intrinsic biophysical constraints. But in neither case is death a central feature or requirement for natural selection. In fact, you might argue that both competition and death are due to something much more fundamental about the natural world, and that's various kinds of finitude, thermodynamic finitude, spatial and resource finitudes. So, by the way, this is not in any way to blunt the theological problems associated with competition, suffering, and death. Those are features of the natural world, and they do raise theological problems. But I am arguing they're not exacerbated by evolution. In fact, some people argue they're blunted by evolution, because although natural selection does not require them, it may employ them. Some go so far as to say natural selection redeems competition and death, because out of it comes something very good. Personally, I'm not persuaded by these arguments at all, because you have to argue why the good is sufficiently compensatory for the suffering, and you also have to argue that you couldn't have achieved the good without the suffering. But nevertheless, there may be a resource for natural theology here, for theodicy here. Okay, lastly, how about the dearth of goodness? Back to Tennyson's statement. Some wild poet, when he works without a conscience or an aim. Without an aim would be, well, there's no evolutionary progress or even directionality. Steve Gould says, progress is a noxious, culturally embedded, untestable, non-operational, intractable idea that must be replaced if we wish to understand evolutionary history. And by the way, I don't like it, according to Gould. Or without a conscience, the absence of goodness or natural beneficence. Michael Gizzle, natural selection is both sufficient and true. It's impossible for a genuinely disinterested or altruistic behavior pattern to evolve. One of my favorite essays in Science and Religion is David Odie's essay from 20 years ago in Zygon, where he looks at this issue. Odie argues that for followers of Darwin, the familiar theological problem of evil was turned inside out. Evil could be assumed, and the existential paradox which demanded explanation became, in fact, the problem of goodness. Now, two quick comments on these issues, and then I'm going to turn things over to Michael. What about evolutionary progress? Is it in fact true that there's no directionality or no progress or even directionality to evolution? This would be many talks in itself. These are complicated issues. Prima facie, it does look that there's some directional trends to evolution: increased diversity, body size, or Cope's rule. If you look at number of cells versus number of cell types, or one of my favorites, metabolic intensity over time, adjusted for body mass. It turns out that there are big arguments about this, whether these represent contingent trends. It's certainly not the case that there are trends in all phylogenetic lines, whether they're biased or unbiased, that is to say, whether there's a selective advantage or whether it just represents the fusion away from a minimum wall. But it is true that all these features have increased over time. And now we might ask a deeper question. Are there any thematically coherent underlying trends to these? And recent work in evolutionary theory suggests, yes, that there's a sequence of transitional escalations. And some, this work is, I think, really cool. It suggests a number of major transitions in evolutionary history. I'm not going to describe them all, but prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells, asexual to sexual reproducers, solitary individuals to eusocial communities, and that all of these trends involve the repackaging of replicating material through cooperation. So if you think about it, that's what multicellularity is, that's what sexuality is, that's what cells with interacting compartments are. And so 40 years ago, Michael Polanyi, in a famous science article, says we can recognize then a strictly defined progression arising from inanimate level to ever higher additional principles of life. And this was kind of, for many decades after, kind of poo-pooed, and it's just within the last few years that people have gone back and affirmed Polanyi's insights. In fact, Carl Sigmund argues, referring to Polanyi's essays, argues that this progress, nowadays described as a series of major transitions in evolution, is often due to the emergence of new cooperative units. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm actually not arguing for evolutionary progress. I don't have enough time to do that. I have to say, personally, I found these persuasive. But even if you didn't, it would not be the case that there is no case to be made. And I think the most magisterial history of the idea of progress and evolution is Michael Russ's From Monad to Man. And in this history, he argues that the idea of progress has never been fully discarded by evolutionary biologists. In science, the majority doesn't win, but in most periods, Russ's argues that it has been the majority view, including with the architects of the synthetic theory, and with current evolutionary biologists like E.O. Wilson or John Maynard Smith. And lastly, how about natural beneficence? I'm actually going to skip over the data for this, which is kind of a natural history slideshow, and just mention that the notion not just of cooperation, but the capacity, there's no other way to say this, the capacity to care and to affiliatively attach to and to exchange benefits with another at cost to oneself, itself has increased over evolutionary history. And there's no other way to think about this. Franz de Waal wants to call this proto-moral goodness, but even if you don't think it's proto-moral, certainly non-moral goodness, it's certainly natural beneficence. And I'll close with two cautions. Is this picturing then repainting a romantic, idealized picture of nature? No, it isn't. It's painting an ambiguous picture of nature that is more ambiguous than either the romantic idealization or than the Victorian and post-Darwinian nihilistic picture presented. Yes, there does seem to be trends, themes, and even progress. Yes, there does seem to be the emergence of natural beneficence. But the emergence of this natural beneficence is riddled with conflicts of interest and propensities for defection. In fact, the more sophisticated the cooperation, the more sophisticated the defections and betrayals can be. So dominant males coming to take interest, coming into dominance in primate societies, taking the legs of recently born infants and bashing them against the heads of rocks, emerge in this context. And secondly, as the capacity to care and attach increases, so does the capacity for suffering. So the question of whether they're fully compensatory benefits, whether there's a theodicy here, is an open one. But the slam dunk argument for evil doesn't seem to be an open and shut case either. And here I want to turn things over to Mike.
Transition to electronic gadgetry here. While Jeff's getting that set up, if he's getting it set up, let me also say I'm very grateful to be here and to have the opportunity to present, and to Dennis and others at Faraday for putting this on. I know this is something that's been going on for a number of years, and it's my first opportunity to participate, and I'm glad to have the chance to do so. And Jeff and I have been giving a number of joint presentations at various places over the last few years. We've been working together as intellectual colleagues and have been writing some things together. And I think you can see we should almost just sit down and start talking now, because you've already been overwhelmed with, I mean, each slide is so fertile with information, not just on the empirical side, but on the philosophical side. Those of you who have a philosophical bent, I'm sure after each slide you wanted to stop and say, boy, that's really rich. There's a lot of interesting stuff you could dig in. There are hundreds of papers to be written here that haven't been written. And that's one of the things that's been really fun about our collaboration. And I really enjoy listening to Jeff do what he does. He does it so masterfully. But he also does it a little longer than he was supposed to, which is fine. I'd much rather listen to him talk than to hear me talk. But I'm going to have to elide and move quickly through some of these slides. So what I'm going to focus on is really a certain aspect of evolutionary evil. That's the overall theme for the talk. And ask some of the hard philosophical questions that arise, and then look at what resources are available for us to respond to these philosophical challenges. Jeff put up quote after quote after quote from naturalists who make the case, although very quickly and without much philosophical sophistication, that the evil that we find that looks like it's intrinsic to the evolutionary process raises specific theological problems. It raises the problem of evil in a distinctive sort of way. And so the question is, are there any philosophical or theological resources for responding to this problem? Now, I haven't been over to the book table yet, but if you monitor the science and religion conversation, you'll notice that there's been a significant uptick in the literature on this topic over the last few years. But I think it's still a topic that's vastly underexplored. So, let me just make a little change here. So for thinking about the evolutionary evil in the context of the broader argument for atheism from evil, got that? Those who think that evil provides us with good reason for denying the existence of God. One thing that you have to do is go back and get clear on what the argument is, and then what would be required in order to get around it. Especially in the context of thinking about the particular sorts of evil that are in view here. So we don't even have time to go through this slide. This is a representation of what in the philosophical world is probably the most widely discussed argument for atheism from evil. And what it essentially says is this, that there are certain evils that exist for no good reason. That's the first premise. The second premise says, if there are evils like that, then there's no God. And so the conclusion is that there is no God. And the important premise in this argument is really that first one, that says that there are instances of suffering that exist for no good reason. If you can't make the case for that, then you can't make the case for the conclusion. So the question is, why would someone think that's true? Or what would you have to do to reasonably believe that it's not true? I mean, there are all sorts of evils out there. The question is, what would we have to say in order to be able to rationally reject that? What would we have to be able to say to show that that's not a premise that we should accept? And you might wonder why I'm spending so much time on this, but I think actually this point, even if I don't get to the other 66 slides, this point is really pretty critical, because I think that a lot of the literature that's been written on this topic fails to address the problem because it doesn't really understand this particular point. So, to help see this, I think it's useful to have an analogy in mind. And the analogy I like to use involves a colleague coming back to the office and telling me with a sly grin that he happened to be in Boston, where he saw my wife in the dark corner of the restaurant sitting with another guy holding hands. And he asked me, "Did you know your wife was in Boston having dinner with this guy in a romantic restaurant?" And I said, "No, actually, she told me she was going to be in New York for the day." So what's the conclusion that one's tempted to draw? You're tempted to draw this conclusion that she's been unfaithful in some way, that there's infidelity. That's really what my colleague thinks. So what would be required for me to resist the infidelity conclusion? What sort of thing would you need? Well, what you don't need is the actual explanation. In order for me to rationally resist the infidelity conclusion, I don't need the actual reason. But I do need a reason that would, if it's true, explain away the apparent evidence of infidelity. And it has to be one that I don't have a positive reason to reject. So I know, for example, that my wife has an uncle in Boston, and his wife is very sick. So I think, well, maybe things really took a turn for the worse, and rather than getting off the train in New York, she just kept on going up to Boston, and the person she was meeting with was her uncle, whom she was trying to comfort because things were going downhill with his wife. Is that what actually happened? you might say, are you telling us a real story? No, this didn't happen. But you might say, well, my colleague might say, well, do you know that's what actually she's doing? I would say, no, but I mean, that might be what it is. I mean, I do know that her uncle's wife is sick, and so maybe that's what's going on. Would that give me a good reason to avoid drawing the infidelity conclusion? Sure, it would. I mean, I might want to go investigate further, but that particular evidence shouldn't lead me to conclude that my wife's been unfaithful, because I can think of a reason which, if it's true, would explain that phenomenon, okay? So when it comes to explaining evolutionary evil, we need something like that as well. We need an account of why the evil is a necessary condition for getting some greater good that we're not warranted in rejecting. That's what we need. We don't need to know that it's true. We just need to know that if it were true, it's a good explanation, and we don't have any reason to reject it. Okay? That's actually a pretty low bar, but it's a bar you've got to clear if your explanation is going to count. Okay. So now, very quickly, I'm going to take you through 4 explanations for the existence of animal pain and suffering in the context of evolution that I think don't work, that are out there, and you hear them repeated over and over again. So one, and this is perhaps the one that's been most common throughout at least Christian theological reflection on animal pain and suffering, both before and after the publication of The Origin of Species, has to do with the fall. So in some way, it's a standard position within Christian theology that all evil is in some way tied to the fall of the original human pair. And that's one of the views that seems to, its foundations has been shaken by evolutionary theory, because what's become clear to us is there's lots of pain, suffering, death, predation, and extinction around before the first human pair. In fact, some contemporary Christians take this as reason to reject evolution altogether. That is, it's so horrible, and we can't tie it to some definitive moral evil, that we would therefore have to account this evil to God, and that doesn't make sense. So here's Henry Morris, the widely known young earth creationist, who says, evolution is the most efficient and cruel method for creating man that could be conceived. If God is a God of love and wisdom and power, as the Bible teaches, then how could he ever be guilty of devising such a scheme as evolution? If one wishes to believe in evolution, he's free to make that choice, but he certainly should not associate a wise, powerful, and loving God with such a monstrous system. Because if we can tie those evils to the existence of some moral evil for which we're responsible, then things make sense. But if we can't do that, we have to account all of these evils to the agency of the divine, and that does not make sense on this picture. But even for those who think that the fall constitutes a good reason for the existence of natural evil and evolutionary, or the sorts of evil we find in animal pain and suffering in particular, there is this, as far as I know, not very much discussed philosophical problem, and I call it the fragility objection. And the objection goes like this. On this picture, the death, destruction, disorder that we see in nature is due to the fact that God constructed the creation so that when Adam and Eve fall, when Adam falls, there are ripples that emanate out from that moral evil, which have these catastrophic effects on the rest of the innocent creation. And one question that we need to ask anyone who wants to defend that theodicy is, isn't that itself a defect in the creation that needs explaining? Why would God have created the world in such a way that these catastrophic effects ripple out from that singular moral event? That's a problem. There are some things that people have said to address that, but I don't find any of them plausible. So that's one issue worth exploring further. A second explanation that you find, and I think this probably is the most common one I hear now, and it has to do, it goes something like this. On this account, unlike there's something that's both similar to and different from the fall accounts. So in the fall accounts, the idea is there was some moral evil that was committed by a human agent, and that had ripple effects throughout nature. On this picture, free agency of a sort is involved, but it's not tethered to a conscious moral agent. Instead, The freedom involved here is intrinsic to the order of creation itself. There's something about creation itself which embeds within it a certain sort of freedom, and that explains why sometimes things go off the rails. In the same way that morally significant agents like us, who have free will, can choose to do evil. In some sense, nature itself has a freedom that allows it to manifest evil. So here's John Polkinghorne. God has created this amazing universe so that life can evolve and come into being endowed with the true freedom required for love. This entails giving a certain amount of freedom to the physical processes and a process of creative destruction via evolution. So you hear this view defended by a number of individuals. Most recently, if you've seen the book by Francis Collins and Carl Giberson called The Language of Science and Faith, is that the title of it? They also defend this position in that book. The problem with this view is really the following 3 points, I think. First of all, despite the label, non-conscious creation isn't free. It may be contingent, it may be unpredictable, but it's not free in the sense that gives you traction within the context of theodicy. And to claim otherwise is just mistakenly anthropomorphic. It's not free. And therefore, it doesn't afford you the sorts of goods, the outweighing goods that justify the evils that come from it. I'm going to skip the second one. So what that means is, remember, the standard is that the evil in question needs to be a necessary condition for securing an outweighing good. So, I leave it to you. This is something we can't discuss in any detail right now. Are all of the natural evils that exist in the cosmos outweighed by the good of a creation that is free in its physical processes? Is that worth the price? I find that very implausible. I'll just mention this one. We don't have time to discuss it. This is not a view that's new to Bill Dembski, although it is the view that he defends in his recent book, The End of Christianity. And what Dembski claims is that it was suitable for God to create a world which contained natural evil, including pervasive animal pain, suffering, death, and predation prior to the fall, because the fall was going to occur later. God was arranging the natural world in such a way that after the fall, those pre-existing evils would have a certain function for human beings. And that function in particular is to show us how bad sin is. So he says, just as the death and resurrection of Christ is responsible for the salvation of repentant people throughout all time, so the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden is responsible for every natural evil throughout all time, future, predistant past, in the predistant past preceding the fall. Why would God have set things up in that way? He says, to make us realize the full extent of human sin. God does not merely allow personal evils to run their course subsequent to the fall. In addition, God allows natural evils to run their course prior to the fall. So God wills the disordering of creation, making it defective on purpose. It is painful to accept that God bears at least some responsibility for natural evil, and that He brings it about. And the justification, he says, is to allow us to see the gravity of our sin. But there are two problems with this. First of all, the reality of natural evil as displayed in our evolutionary past doesn't have that effect. In fact, it doesn't do that. It doesn't help us to see that, I don't think, or at least for very few people does it have that sort of effect. And the second issue is, the good, it seems, is not outweighing. The good of coming to that recognition is not worth the price of all the pain, suffering, death, and predation of these innocent creatures. All right, the last one is one that comes from Francisco Ayala. And Ayala claims that God is not accountable for natural evil because, in contrast to Dembski's view, where God directly causes all this evil, evil arises by natural rather than divine causes. So he says, a major burden was removed from the shoulders of believers when convincing evidence was advanced that the design of organisms need not be attributed to the immediate agency of the Creator, but is rather an outcome of natural processes. It's nature that's to blame for evil, including evolutionary evil, not God. And this view is repeated by a number of people, and it's very unsatisfying. He says, on this view, theists must acknowledge Darwin's revolution and accept natural selection as the process that accounts for the design of organisms, as well as the dysfunctions, oddities, cruelties, and sadism that pervade the world of life. It's evolution, not God, that's the culprit for evolutionary evil. But of course, this view just transfers the problem up one level. God isn't the direct cause of evil, but God's responsible for implementing the mechanism that God knew would lead to those ends. Right? So you might put it this way: it's a bad thing to drive someone home when you're drunk, but it's no better to put them in a car with a known inebriated chauffeur. Right? In essence, that's what God's done on this picture, and that doesn't alleviate any divine responsibility. I think that's a quote from you. So those are the explanations that, as far as I'm concerned, don't work. What about ones that do work? Well, we're going to have to do this rapid fire, but we have some time to discuss.
You can take an extra minutes because
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let me just to, tell you something. Give you a few possibilities very briefly. There are in the book that I wrote on this topic. There are three that I consider. The first one I'll go through quickly because you won't like it and won't find it plausible anyway. But you should not dismiss this one so quickly. Okay. So as many know, Descartes thought that non-human animals were incapable of much in the way of intellection, or they didn't have much in the way of cognitive states at all. They were just non-conscious machinery. That view is probably too strong, but it does lead us to ask the question of what non-human animal consciousness is like. What are the states that non-human animals experience when, for example, they're subject to injury or predation? And how would we know that? There are lots of people that presume that the answer to that question is easy, and it is not easy. It is very difficult. And in fact, the more we know about the nature of consciousness, the more difficult this problem becomes. And I'll just give you one, I'd love to talk about this for a long time, but I can't. But let me just give you one illustration. So there's a phenomenon, some of you have probably heard of it, called blind sight. And it occurs in some patients who've had a lesion to a certain part of their visual cortex, in which they claim to be blind, either entirely or in certain respects, but in fact they display behaviors that show for sure that they have a certain kind of visual acuity. So they can point to it, they'll say, be asked to point to a spot on a screen with a red dot, and they can do it even though they claim not to be able to see. They'll say, I can't, but how can I do that? I can't see. And they say, well, just try. Do your best to point to where you think a red dot might be on the screen. And they can do it. They can navigate. There's a really cool video up on the Scientific American website of somebody who has blind sight who actually walks down this hallway, navigating around all of these obstacles, although the person claims to be blind, can't see anything. What's going on there? Well, what's going on there is that there's some kind of a distinction between being able to see and having a phenomenal conscious awareness of your seeing. Right? These people can see, but they don't have a phenomenal conscious awareness of their seeing. So there's a way of disconnecting those two things. Having the perceptual states that allow you to successfully navigate in the world, and having a way that it feels to you to have those that sort of acuity. So when it comes to non-human animals, how much do they have of the former? How much do they have of the latter? Obviously, they can do things like run around and navigate around obstacles. But does it feel to them a certain way to do that? Obviously, they can recoil from noxious stimuli that to us are associated with feelings of pain. Did they have those feelings of pain? These are open questions. And furthermore, just one other thing. We also know that we're highly disposed to attribute phenomenal conscious states to things that don't have them. This is quite widely demonstrated empirically. You can do a little experiment with robots in an arena where you either put a face on top of them or you don't, and you can ask students, the experimental subjects, to describe what the robots are doing, and without the face, they just describe it in purely mechanistic terms. Put a face on the top, they start describing what's going on in intentional terms. It wants to do such and such, it's trying to avoid so and so. Right? We naturally default to these intentional type explanations. So is that are we over-attributing this sort of consciousness to animals? It's a difficult question. But if it turns, insofar as non-human animals lack phenomenal consciousness when it comes to pain perception, so far does one problem of evolutionary evil get easier to solve. Okay? But let's set that one aside. Here are two other possibilities. I should back up. If Neo-Cartesianism is wrong, then what do we need? And what we need is some sort of explanation for why the kinds of pain and suffering that animals experience is good for them. So here's one possibility. Some have argued that, as in humans, non-human pain and suffering either permits actions of great moral significance. Richard Swinburne's an example of somebody who claims that. Or that it permits animals to engage in a kind of soul-making that perhaps benefits them in the afterlife. There are a number of folks out there who've been defending a non-human animal immortality and arguing that in the same way that this life is an arena for soul-making for human beings, it is for non-human animals as well. Well, I'm not going to comment on that. We can talk about that in discussion. But there's a second way of understanding this view, this notion of embodied intentionality and its role in explaining non-human animal pain and suffering. It goes like this. When embodied creatures act on intentions, there must be some mechanism that allows them to weigh the good of achieving desired ends against the ills of the noxious injury that results. So if you want to be a fire walker, if there's not some mechanism that tells you, hey, you could burn up doing this, then you're not put in a position where you can weigh the ends that you intend to achieve with the dangers that attend the process of achieving it. So, so what we need then, if there are agents like that act on intentions to achieve goals, but they're embodied, you need some mechanism that's going to warn you when achieving the goal you're aiming to get at is likely to cause you serious bodily injury. But the question is, well, why would it be pain? Why would pain be the thing? Why couldn't you just have a red light that comes on that says, "Oh, danger here! Hey, if you keep going down this, right?" Or just a little a meter in your mind, right? You sort of see the little needle move, right? As the likelihood of injury increases, just the needle goes up, so you can consciously weigh. Oh, I see danger. Maybe I better slow down. But in fact, there's been research done on this particular question. Some of you know the works of Paul Brand, who worked with patients with Hansen's disease who lose the ability to feel pain in their peripheral digits. And they tried various ways to help them regain some sense of the danger of noxious injury. They put these pressure-sensitive gloves on the patients, and if they squeezed something too hard, it would make a tone in their ear, or a little light would come out. It never worked. Never worked, because if people really wanted to do something, they would do it. They just ignore the sound, or they would not ignore the light. The only thing that worked, they could still feel pain in their underarm for reasons I can explain later. So they would wire up a battery, and it would shock them in their underarm when they squeezed too hard. Even then, I won't show you the slide, but they were viewing a patient who was trying to actually use a wrench, and as he pushed too hard, the pressure-sensitive glove caused the shock. So finally, the guy unbuttoned his shirt, reached up underneath, pulled the wire off, right? Got the nut off, and then reconnected the wire. The only thing that worked to prevent them from incurring this noxious injury was pain that they couldn't prevent. So there's something about the way intentional agents are wired up that might make pain the only way or the best way. Well, there's one last, that's too long to go through. But the last solution I think worth considering is one that goes like this. If it's a good thing to have a cosmos that's ordered by natural laws, and if it's a good thing for that cosmos to evolve over time from states of, I call it like chaos to order, if those two things are good things, and by the way, those two features of the cosmos have been thought to be good within the history of Christian thought at any rate, but at various junctures for reasons that have nothing to do with evolution or cosmology or anything like that. That there's something about a clockwork universe of that sort that has great intrinsic value. If that's true, if those two things are indeed goods, then the pathway from initial states of chaos to human beings has to include a number of intermediate steps. And those intermediate steps are going to include organisms that include increasing levels of cognitive complexity and phenomenal awareness. So it may just be the case that as stepping stones to achieving organisms that have the kinds of moral capabilities, free will, the special cognitive capabilities that human beings exhibit, and which theologians have thought allow human beings to distinctively manifest the divine image, those intermediate steps need to be passed through. It's simply an unavoidable consequence if those are indeed two good features of the created order. So the question is, are those indeed good features, and are they outweighing features? That is, are they good enough to account for the kinds of pain and suffering that the evolutionary process involves? Well, I think the right thing is for me to stop at this point, and for us to take some questions. Obviously, there's a lot of details in there, and I'd be happy to talk about any of those during the Q&A time.
Okay, so over to you for questions on this huge topic. David, yeah.
I know I've already talked about this with both of you guys in the past, but just for the sake of
So
discussion.
hang on 1 second. I think I'm doing something.
I think it's this way we can interfere with it.
Okay.
Do we sit or stand? What's the
Stand up, yeah. That's just fine where you are. David, yes, so, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I guess I have a question with the whole, or a problem with the whole idea of natural evil. I don't know why we should consider things like suffering and death to be evil in any sense. I would see life as being fundamentally composed of life replacing life in various ways, and that things like eating and health are just the other side of the coin and no fundamentally different from being eaten and parasitism in a metaphysical sense, unless humans are doing it. So I just like you to respond to this idea that what would you say to someone who, like me, who sees the whole history of talk about natural evil just to be anthropocentric, and that we are basically projecting things that would be evil if we did them to someone else because we don't like them and they hurt us, to be evil in the natural world?
Well, I guess we'll both take a stab at this, but I mean, I guess I would say two things. First of all, there is an existential element here, and for somebody who doesn't see a problem,
I think you need this.
somebody who doesn't see a problem, okay, you don't see a problem. That's not most people. I mean, most people see a huge problem there. And secondly, and here's more rational response. I'm not sure it's anthropocentric projection. I think it involves theological projection. That if you see things going on in the world that entail events, that if we perpetrated them,
Yeah.
or I'm just gonna,
Just shout.
or if we had the power to prevent, but didn't prevent, that people would find us morally culpable. It seems to me to be very easy to say, well then if there is a God who has the power to prevent these things, if we would hold a human morally culpable for not preventing them, how could we not hold a presumably morally perfect, omnipotent being innocent for not preventing them? So that would be my response.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick thing. Part of the problem here is defining what are the things that need to be explained. How do we decide what those are? What counts as an evil? Because you'll oftentimes, when we give talks like this, people will say, well, I don't see any of these things as evil because they're all necessary stepping stones to some greater good. Doesn't that make them, in fact, good? And the answer is no, it doesn't. Why? Because evils are those things which are such that we'd be objectively better off if they weren't there, aside from the fact that they're necessary conditions for bringing about these greater goods. So if you could eliminate them, but still keep the greater good, things would be objectively better off. So now the question is, when we think about things like predation and the suffering of animals who are experiencing death, would things be better off if that weren't the case? Leaving aside any goods for which they're necessary conditions, would things be better off? And you might say, no, or I don't know. But here's a reason to think the answer is yes, at least from within a Christian context, because it looks like in the eschaton, those things are absent. And if that's an indication that things are better off when they're absent, then they genuinely count as evils.
Okay, yes, please.
I thought this question was going to be stupid, but it actually lines up with what David said, so it can't be stupid. It seems what we're doing is we're looking at a local suffering and we're trying to generate a global good from it. Instead of asking the question, is there a local good that comes from a local suffering? So for every unhappy gazelle, there's a happy lion. So does that not make a zero sum?
Well, it might, but actually the last point I just made speaks to that point as well. So if it turns out that things would be objectively better off were that evil to be absent, or that state of affairs to be absent, aside from any greater good for which it's a necessary condition. Sorry, it's a long sentence. It's probably a simpler way of saying that. But the answer is yes. If it turns out that you don't lose the good of the happy lion, but you do lose the bad of the pain-racked death of the gazelle, then that thing really does count as an evil.
Yeah, because you have the happy lion without the unhappy gazelle. The eschatological picture is the lion will lay down with the lamb, right? And even if it's a metaphor of something.
You have to take it back when we spoke.
Rodney.
Yeah.
Same topic, really, because in the Psalms we read that the lion roars for its food and God gives it its food. So that seems to be asserting that it's not intrinsically evil. Though I take your point about the eschaton.
Well, being sated is good. That's a good thing. But being sated by eating a creature that experiences horrific pain and suffering is a different story.
It's God is described as doing it, though, as feeding the lion.
That doesn't make it not evil. I mean, no, I'm seriously. There are people who argue that God is the author of evil, and that doesn't make it not evil. That just means, presumably, if God is the author, that there is a compensatory good. But if you're doing theodicy, then you have to figure out what the compensatory good is, or what a plausible compensatory good is. And by the way, back to David's point, I mean, perhaps, I have lots of colleagues in biology, especially, who don't find these issues vexing. But theodicy is the enterprise of trying to give assistance to people who do find them vexing.
Okay, yes, Fiona, yes.
It struck me that your slide, Jeff, that quote in Nature about evolution being very wasteful and going down a lot of blind alleys. The same description could be perfectly applied as well to the scientific career path. And you go down a lot of blind alleys there. A lot of the animals are killed and tested and made to suffer in the names of science. And a lot of people work really, really hard and then kind of reach their level, and then they're out of science and they're sort of culled off. And that can cause a lot of pain. And yes, you go to it's a very, very convoluted pattern. Does this mean, therefore, that science is inherently evil and that scientists are inherently evil? And should we not therefore do science? Because suffering is caused by it.
Just while they're thinking of the answer of that, let me just say a little plug. There is an article in the next issue of Science and Christian Belief which is exactly on that point. And it's drawing on, it's actually by a mathematician. And it's the natural selection of mathematical theories and wastage in the scientific development. So just because they're looking puzzled and by just filling in while they're thinking about the answers. Right, Michael?
Well, I guess a couple of quick responses. First of all, that quote from David Hall and a number of other depictions of evolution in natural history. It's not just arguing that there is happenstance or waste or contingency, but in fact, that's the core of the process. That it's ultimately teleological. Steve Gould's quote, I left this one out, but he describes evolutionary history as a drunk stumbling down an alley, collapsing into a gutter. So at least in a scientific career, you formulate goals. There may be contingencies in getting there, you may change goals, but this depiction of evolutionary history is that it is goal-less. And here, by the way, there are a couple of ways of thinking about goals. Clearly, evolution is not a conscious process. It's not a regulated teleological process in the sense that human plans their careers, or even that, like, your hypothalamus regulates your body temperature. But nevertheless, it may be directed. It may be directed by all sorts of constraints and on possibility space. And those constraints may, in fact, reflect the goals of a divine architect. So I would say, first of all, I think that depiction of evolutionary history is wrong. And a number of my colleagues with how any theological axe to grind would agree on that. And secondly, with respect to, an academic career, well, I don't think, John Polkinghorne makes this point actually, that in order for you to have any sense of teleology, you have to have a mixture of both contingency and determinism. So the fact that people's careers are filled, or the fact that scientific theories are worked out with ideas that turn out to be wrong, you revise them, they're wrong again, you revise them. It's kind of the way that natural selection works. And that doesn't seem to me to raise any moral questions.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Probably more could be said on that one. But other questions? Have we now resolved the problem of theodicy? It's all settled? No? Okay, another question, yes.
I was thinking like the history of Christianity is also about suffering. And I wouldn't say that the life of Christ, which is a life of suffering, is a story of evil. And it's rather, well, it can be seen in many different ways, but I see it as rather a cause of falling from God, and then the suffering is the act of actually coming close to God again. So I don't really understand the link between evil and suffering in theology. Does that make sense?
Sure. Although I think the basic idea still remains the same. That well, there are a couple of different issues here. So one has to do with again here, of course, we're just speaking in the Christian context now. The incarnation of Christ is an event that serves a number of important divine aims. One, as a matter of fact, has to do with the redemption of fallen human beings. But that's not the only aim that it serves, and so some of you might know that there have been debates at various junctures in theological history about whether or not the incarnation would have occurred even if there was no fall. And in fact, there were a number of theologians, especially in certain periods in the Middle Ages, who defended the claim that it would. The intrinsic goodness of the incarnation is such that it would have occurred even if it weren't for the purposes of Jesus' redemptive suffering. But it did also serve that purpose, in fact, on the Christian account of things. The question is, would that have occurred anyway? And the answer is presumably no. I mean, the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ occurs only in response to, or to serve the need of, redeeming fallen human beings. So it serves a certain greater good. Were it not to serve that good, it wouldn't have occurred, because God wouldn't have allowed it. Things would have been all things considered better had that not happened. But it had to happen in order to bring about, as a necessary condition for bringing about a certain greater good. So again, on the Christian account of things, it happened. It brings about a greater good, but it, all on its own, is an evil in this way of using the term. It's a bad thing that was a necessary condition for bringing about a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, Renee.
Can I comment on that?
Sorry, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess following up on Michael, I might want to try to make the distinction between what we experience as a net evil and what we judge to be, what we experience as an evil and what we judge to be a net evil. So the things that we experience as evils, I'm reticent to relinquish altogether the deep sense that many human beings have that involves the wish that life not contain certain things. And I'll speak personally here as the son of a Holocaust refugee. I say it doesn't make any sense to me to try to make peace with that experience and say, well, suffering's part of life, it's not that bad. I mean, it really is that bad. And the vision of life redeemed in many faith traditions involves the elimination of suffering. So I don't have any problem calling those things evils. Now, are they net evils? although we wish they weren't here, is the cosmos really, would it be better off if they weren't here now? And that's part of what theology and theodicy are about. But here I would make the distinction between what I envision as suffering and what the Abrahamic scriptures actually describe as torment. So suffering alone may involve pain with a purpose. Torment is pain with no purpose. And I think the theodicy question, the accusations that people are making is actually not just that the world contains suffering, but it's all torment. That there's nothing redemptive about it, there's no compensatory good, there's no reason why this suffering is necessary for a compensatory good, it's just sheer torment. And one of the roles of theodicy here is to provide an account in which it may not be sheer torment. It may involve temporal evils that we yearn to not have here someday, but in this instantiation of existence actually do accrue benefits for which they're necessary.
Okay, so René first, I think, then yes.
So I want to go to Rowe's argument and make a point you're fully aware of. So Rowe's argument involves the idea that there are evils such that God couldn't have good reasons for allowing those evils. Now, of course, it's an incredible, nasty task to argue for a particular evil that it is such that God couldn't possibly have a good reason for allowing it. Well, you need to be omniscient in order to, well, you need to know about God's overall plans. You need to know perhaps certain limitations within which God needs to work. So I appreciate that the positive moves in the final part of Michael's presentation that you're making, but it seems in this sort of discussion for me it's always sort of fall back, move, well, to stay in a very positive way. This here, we are experiencing an evil, also a natural evil, or an instance of animal suffering such that there couldn't be a divine reason for allowing it. Well, we're not in that epistemic position.
Right.
Can you repeat the question?
Can I repeat the question? So well, let me put it in my own words, and if you object, then you can restate it. But what René is getting at is a hot point of contention within contemporary philosophy of religion, and it has to do with Rowe's argument. So as I said, the controversial premise in Rowe's argument is that there are instances of gratuitous, in philosophy we call them gratuitous evils, evils for which there's no good reason. And the question is, would anybody ever be justified in thinking that? And you might think, and this is I think the essence of the question, no, you would never be justified in believing that. Why? Because in order for there to be a gratuitous evil, an evil for which there's no good reason, you'd have to know all the kinds of reasons that God might have for permitting it, and guess what? You can't know that. So you're just never in a position to make a judgment that that first premise is true, that there really are gratuitous evils. End of the argument. Can't go any further. So in one sense, the next step in the question might be, so why did you waste your time on all that other stuff? Because there's no point in doing all that, right? You're trying to justify something that now you didn't say that, of course, but you might not. There's no point in trying to justify these things because there's no reason to think they're gratuitous in the first place. That's a really interesting point, and this is a very interesting issue within contemporary philosophy. But let me say this. So let me give you an analogy. Some of you have heard versions of this analogy. Some will say that when the atheist offers that argument, they're offering what in the philosophical lingo is called a no-seum argument. So I don't see any reason that would justify God's permitting the suffering of these animals, so there isn't one. Right? If I can't see it, then there isn't a good reason for it. And no-seum arguments, they work sometimes and they don't work in other times. Here's an example of where they don't work. So you go to the doctor's office, you need to get a shot. The doctor pulls the protective sleeve off the needle, drops the needle on the ground, bends down to pick it up and comes over and rolls up your sleeve and you say, hey, hang on a second there. I think you took the sleeve off that needle and you dropped it. It might be dirty, right? And the doctor picks it up and looks at the needle. No, I don't see any germs on there, right? And you say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Just the fact that you don't see the germs isn't a good reason to think they're not there, right? Because you're not in the right position. You don't have the right magnification of your vision to know whether there really are germs there. Now, maybe you convince the doctor, right, that that's a good reason to get a different needle, right? Because you say, you see, that kind of reasoning you used, I don't see them so that they're not there. That's not a good kind of reasoning. The doctor says, yeah, okay, that's not a good kind of reasoning. Let me get a new needle. But it would be, here's another thing you might do. You might say, hey doctor, come over to the microscope over here and give me that needle. Right? You put it underneath there and you zoom up the magnification and say, see all those little bugs on there? That's what I was talking about. I take the task of theodicy to be like that. That is, it's one thing to say to the critic offering the evidential problem of evil, hey, there's some flawed reasoning involved with that first premise, and therefore you shouldn't accept it. But if we could go one step further and say, hey, you know those evils that you think are gratuitous? Well, here are maybe some actual good reasons, outweighing reasons why God might have permitted them. That's a worthwhile exercise for that reason.
So, of course, I wasn't aborting the sort of project you were,
You know,
or the sort of argument you were making. But, you know, there seems to be some wisdom in acknowledging that there are epistemic limits in what we can identify. And, you know, if God were completely beyond our ken, right, then we would be in a desperate position. But we have to go on a little thing that we know, and these sorts of exercises I think are really important and helpful. But there is this reminder in the Nocean response that I think is valid.
Right. So that's right. So these, so we all could use an extra dose of intellectual humility with respect to these issues, a sort that's not displayed in a lot of the quotes that Jeff was showing you earlier, where you have these naturalists who make these very confident pronouncements about the fact that evolution and the suffering that attends it occurs for no good reason. And that's a very, very bold and intellectually arrogant statement to make. Just one little other last thing. Notice I intentionally set the bar for myself extremely low right at the beginning and said, all these things, all these accounts I'm giving you, I don't have to know that any of them are true for them to have the philosophical punch that they need to have with respect to this argument. So I'm not really claiming much confidence in any of those things that I said, but you don't actually need them to do the philosophical work of theodicy.
Just for American English has this word noceum, it's sort of American natural history, okay, which we don't have in England. So if you go and walk in the Adirondack Mountains, you have a lot of noceums. They're little creatures that bite you and you can't see them. They're called noceums. I have to explain that because we don't have them.
Right.
Yeah, you know, we don't have that expression in other parts of the world. Okay, I think we have time. Wow, a lot of hands going up. But there's one right at the back that's been waiting for some time. I think we just have time for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you. It seems to me that the discussion dwelled a lot upon the evilness of God, and maybe it should have started on the evil that man does, the evil that man is. And I am very fond of a parallel of a piece of advice on talking about evil. Shouldn't we first contemplate ourselves in a mirror? And going into religious talking, are we not, if one thinks about it seriously, the worst, what's the word? We have been given a dominion and we are stewards. Are we not, in fact, the worst steward possible for the dominion we have been given? Looking around, or
If you keep it fairly short because we're out of time really.
Well, I just have
a
a quick response to that. I don't think any discussion of anything, but especially any theological topic, should lose sight of our own frailty and our own moral poverty. But one of the reasons I think this topic is important is actually for that very reason. Many people, in recognition of their own moral frailty, look to God as a source of instruction and even empowerment. And if there are voices that argue that actually whatever being that you might look to for moral guidance or moral empowerment, there are good reasons to think that that being is not a moral being, or not a being of sufficient power to change your life or direct in any way the course of history, well, then I think those arguments need to be engaged for the very sake of cultivating confidence and credible faith in a moral being to whom we have access.